morning. Today we have an ambitious program because we're going to finish up with India and we're going to do the review questions, and I'm going to speak a little bit about the exam, and then we're going to hopefully get into a sort of introduction to China. So that's the program. So beginning with the with India, remember last time I talked about the decline of the Mughals, which was fully visible at the beginning of the 18th century, following the authoritarian rule of Aurangzeb. The whole thing fell apart into 7 or 8 big conflicting states, and there was endemic warfare through the 18th century. And in terms of explaining the demise of the Mughals, we can say that overexploitation, taking the fiscal oppression of the population and the alienation of the population, which had no real stake in the regime, is, I think, primarily responsible. And this was intensified by the fact that at the bottom of Indian society, there were these autonomous villages who really, except for the fact that they had to pay tribute, had a self-sufficient economy, which it was deeply localistic, sort of economic system, largely static in terms of economic growth, and the ordinary villages in the millions had no relationship to this state system except that they had to pay taxes through coercion, essentially. Taxes were taken from them. They got nothing back. So they were completely alienated from the regime. And of course, we're talking about overexploitation and vast inequality and economic stagnation. Things were getting worse because of the oppressive taxation. And so, in this kind of a context, you had political combined with religious dissidents. And I talked about Bhakti and also the Hindus. The most important state that emerged was, in fact, a reincarnation of a Hindu state, the Maratha Confederacy, developed in the late 17th and early 18th century, but there were others as well. And in terms of who led these states, obviously the peasants and the craftsmen were in rebellion, and they had political and religious complaints. The Aurangzeb he was a Muslim, and he was very oppressive. The Hindus were rebelling, but also the Sikhs, and so on. But the leaders were the zamindars, as I have explained. That is to say, these local elites who were the ones charged by the Mughal state to extract the taxes. Well, they just refused to send the tribute up to the top. The Manzabdars and the emperor were, in a way, isolated. And some of these zamindars emerged as local potentates, local rulers, who replaced the rule of the central government. Now, this, of course, meant that India was divided. And then it was then open to foreign conquests. So certainly foreign conquest is an important factor. The French, and particularly the English. But the internal situation of India is more important if India had been united, if there was real support from the common people for the state apparatus, there's no way that the French or the English could have conquered India, but such was not the case. Now, the most important foreigner were increasingly the English. The French were present, and particularly in southeastern India, but it was the English who, by the middle of the 18th century, had about 150 different trading outposts along the coast of India, the most important of which was Calcutta. The English were deeply entrenched in Calcutta. They had extensive connections with the local zamindars and the local merchants. And so Calcutta was the most important sort of trading outpost of the English. And the English, above all, were exporting Indian goods. They were exporting silk and sugar and rice and saltpeter and notably opium. I would underline that. That's very important because it bears on what happens to China. And they were exporting some of this to India, to England, but also they were engaged in the Asian trade. The English began to become more and more of a factor in the Asian trade in general. Well, by 1750, the English East India Company, it was a private company, based on stock, it was a joint stock company that had been founded at the beginning of the 17th century. They got into a fight with the Nabob of Bengal, the local ruler, and he tried to interfere with them and so on, and the English found allies, the zamindars, some of the merchants were in support of them. Meanwhile, the Nabob contacted the French and he asked for French assistance against the English. In Bengal, at a place called Plassey in 1757, there was a showdown between the Nabob and the French on the one hand, and the English and their allies. The English had a well-equipped, well-trained army, but it was small, about 5,000 men. And at Plassey in 1757, they defeated the Nabob and the French. Essentially, with this conquest in Bengal, this is centered on in Bengal, the way was opened for the overall conquest by the English, the takeover by the English East India Company. It was not the English government, it was the East India Company, a private company that was doing it. They proceeded with great violence. They certainly allied with whoever they could. It was a question of divide and conquer. They didn't do this alone. They had help from various Indian princes and so on. But the English proceeded first to conquer Bengal, then in a series of steps, they took over the rest of India by 1820, meeting resistance. There was a considerable resistance, but we're talking about the military revolution. We're talking about, in Europe, the development of these very formidable armies, well-equipped, well-trained, with extremely modern weapons, well-financed. And so the East India Company was able to take over India. As I said, at the beginning especially, there was huge violence and plundering by the English, and the English who participated in this, and many Englishmen went out to India because it was so attractive from that point of view. Great fortunes were made in India, and most of this money went gold, because they forced, wherever they conquered, they forced the local authorities to basically provide ransoms and so on. And so there was a huge amount of money, and it was basically shipped back to England. Private fortunes, the East India Company, and even the English government made a lot of money in these years between 1760 and 1820. And a lot of this money found its way into English banks, and it helped to finance the coincident Industrial Revolution. This is the period of the Industrial Revolution. Well, the financing, a lot of it came from India. And secondly, the English were involved in these great wars with the French, commercial wars, but also political rivalries. They reached their peak during the French Revolution and the period of Napoleon, and a lot of the financing of these wars also came, not all of it, but a lot of it came from the conquest of India. Now, the smoke clears, but the English begin to set up the English East India Company. And I want to stress at this point, this is a private company. This is a joint stock company. It's not a government that's doing this. In the same way, we see here the Hudson's Bay Company. This is a joint stock company out of London. The government here in this part of the world was basically a private English company. And it gives you a sense of the developing power of capitalism, because not only was it an economic operation, but it also had its military arm. In other words, it had the capacity to, in the same way as you have private companies, private mercenary companies today, employed by the United States in particular, but other countries as well, who basically what they do is basically they carry out the will of certain governments. Well, the company had its little army, and this is what it did. So it gives you a sense of how powerful capitalism had developed by the late 18th, early 19th century. Now, the first important consequence of all of this was what happened to the Indian textile industry. Because, as I explained, since the 17th century, the cotton industry, which was, in terms of its technology, it was basically hand manufactured with very simple tools and so on. But nevertheless, the Indian spinners and weavers were incredibly skilled, highly skilled, and Indian cotton conquered the world, Asia, Europe, and there was this balance of payments problem in Europe because these cottons were so much in demand. Well, by this point, the Industrial Revolution had kicked in. The English set up cotton machine manufacturing factories in the hundreds, places like Lancashire, and then they fixed the tariffs, the Indian tariffs, to make it very difficult for the Indians to export cotton to Europe, where the English were conquering the markets, and to facilitate the entry of English cotton textile into India. And over time, they destroyed the Indian cotton manufacturing industry. Of course, today we see the situation has changed. And particularly Bangladesh, that area, which is of course a separate state now, that in terms of world textile manufacturing, India and particularly Bangladesh have a huge percentage of the world market today. But back then, the English destroyed this cotton manufacturing industry, and of course, it was to their benefit because the Indians imported these cheap English manufactured cottons, and they flooded the huge Indian market. And all of this money went back to England, aside from the taxes that the English were able to extract from their colonial administration. In addition, this strengthening of the English economic position made it possible for them to expand their activities in the Asian trade. And whereas up to 1750, the Asian trade, the English and French the Dutch were important, but the Asians had continued to have some influence. By 1800, the English East India Company had basically taken over the heights of the commercial activity in Asia. So not only did they control the English economy, but also the commercial aspect of economic life throughout Asia. Notable was the growing trade with China, the English East India Company, trading with China, trading cotton goods, of course, but also more and more opium being sent to China. Within India, the English, they basically, and we could say that this was a positive aspect, they destroyed the sort of autarkic, sort of isolated villages. They destroyed that whole system. And the villages became open to the overall economy in the course of the 19th century. We could call it stagnant, local self-sufficient economy was opened up and commercialized by the English in the course of the 19th century. And in addition to that, absolute property rights were established. The landlords became absolute property holders in conformity to English law. In other words, I explained that absolute property rights were established in the first big capitalist country, England, at the end of the 17th century. Now this system is established in India, and therefore you have the development of a real landlord class. Whereas prior to this, of course, there were elites, but their right to property was always conditional. Now you have the entrenchment of absolute property rights in England. And what we could say the establishment of landlordism, a landlord class is definitely established in England, in India. Some people took a positive view of this because they said India was stagnant, didn't have economic development. As a matter of fact, Karl Marx, he regarded this as a positive development. England was forced, by conquest, to enter the modern world, and it would develop, is what he said. Ultimately, the Indians would kick out the British, which of course was true. But somebody like Mahatma Gandhi, who was the central figure in the independence movement in India, he looked with nostalgia at the so-called stagnant village autonomous system where artisans and peasants had basically a sort of independent life, a life which fulfilled most of their basic needs, but didn't develop. What's so great about development? That's Gandhi's view of the matter. Of course, his view did not prevail, and of course, India today is a fully capitalist country. I would say another factor, India, in terms of the development of the British Empire, was extremely important. The taxes, the unequal commercial relationships, balance of trade, meant that every year huge surpluses were extracted from India and made their way to England. And also the English arranged for literally millions of Indians, impoverished Indians, who had no choice to basically go work in various parts of the British Empire, notably the Caribbean. Slavery was abolished, but the English established a system of what they called indentured labor, which is a kind of partial slave system. And literally millions of Indians went to the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world to work basically on British plantations in Africa and in Latin America. And also, the English, of course, under their command, they had at their disposal a huge Indian army developed under British control, white officers and the rank and file being Indian. And these people became extremely important auxiliaries. The British used Indian auxiliaries in policing their empire. It wasn't the British army that did most of the dirty work. It was Indian people who worked for the British. Now, in terms of positive outcomes, I would point to two things that the English did. Eventually, out of necessity, they began to provide education, Western-style education in India in the course it developed in the 19th century, and an educated middle class did emerge in the course of the 19th century. Obviously, there were landlords, but also an educated middle class that developed in India, and this class also became a commercial and manufacturing class eventually. They formed the basis of this, so a middle class emerged. And also, the English built the Indian National Railway. They, for the first time, really unified the Indian continent by building this vast railway, just as they were building a railway, the British, across Canada and the British capital, and throughout Latin America and Africa. The British put down railways. They built the Indian National Railway, and it unified India, brought the various parts of India, and it unified the Indian market in a commercial sense. That being said, we can say that there was little or no economic development under the British. The British took advantage of India. They just extracted surplus. This was the British called India the jewel in the crown of empire. That was their reference. And we can say that, econometric studies of the Indian economy estimate that in 1756, the point of conquest, the Indian economy overall, it produced 26% of the world GDP. A quarter of the world GDP was produced by India. When we come to the point of independence in 1947, the Indian share of the world economy was 4% in 1947. So you can see the difference. So I think that takes care of that. I forgot to give out the sheet, please. Now I want to turn to the review question and the question of the exam. So I think what I'm going to do, or the way I'm going to start this, is I'm going to start with looking at the review questions now. And I'm going to start with the question, account for the decline of the Mughal Empire, because we just covered it. So it's useful to start with that, decline of the Mughal Empire. And recall what I said about this question. And I stressed overexploitation. And remember, I said that the tax level from Akbar to Aurangzeb increased 2.5 times, and the condition of the peasants declined. A second factor was the rivalry between the Manzabdars and the Zamindars. I explained that. The local elites is against the elite at the center, and these two groups tried to hold on to as much of the tax surplus as they could. That's secondly. Thirdly, the autarkic, localized nature of the village life at the local level, cut off from except for the extraction of tax surpluses, cut off from, and not interested in the government. The government was an oppressor, was from their point of view, and so they had no commitment. Ordinary people had no commitment to this government. And then I stressed the fact that based on bhakti in particular, but also Hindu-Muslim rivalry, religious conflict became more and more prominent in the 17th century, especially under Aurangzeb. These different religious sects became sort of militarized, politicized, and they began to basically challenge the rule of the central government, especially stress the Maratha Confederacy. Now, the denouement, the end of this is, of course, with the end of the reign of the tyrannical Aurangzeb, India splits apart into these 7 or 8 big states, and this division, the lack of unity, opens the way for the English conquest. Now that's a brief summary of an answer. What you have to do in terms of your answer for the exam is to give me a little bit more, to make these points. You outline the points that I've made, but fill them in a bit. Give me some dates, give me some names, and so on. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a sense that you understand the basic causation, but you need to give me some dates and names and so on in terms of an answer. Now, somebody asked me about the length of an answer, and I just, out of the top of my head, I said 3 pages. Listen, the answer, what I just said, making sure that you have the 5 points that I've noted, and giving me some detail. It can be 2 pages. It can be 7 pages as an answer. It depends on what it takes you in terms of answering the exam question. Some people can write with great concision. They can get a lot in. And some people it takes, they want to discuss things at greater length. So that's the way I would answer that particular question. Now the exam, the classes conclude on the 12th. On the 13th, I will send you your exam as an email attachment, and it will be of the 31 questions, there will be 9 questions on the exam, and the exam will be divided into 3 parts. 3 questions in part 1, 3 parts in question 2, 3 parts in question 3. This is to assure that you sort of develop your answers in terms of the whole extent of the class. In other words, you have to answer a question from each of these 3 parts. Okay? So that is the setup, and you choose in each part, you choose one question to answer. So the total number of your answers should be 3. 3 for the exam, three exam questions. Choice of 3 out of overall 9 questions, which will appear on your examination sheet. So that's the setup. Now I just want to now continue with the review question. Okay. So I answered this question about account for the decline of the Mughal Empire. And then the very next question asks, how were the English able to conquer India? So you want to begin, this is more or less this question. This question is the same as the previous question, except you start with the English conquest. You describe the English conquest, but then you have to say, of course, the English were able to conquer India because India was divided. India was ridden with religious and political conflicts. There was overexploitation. There was rivalry between the Manzabdars and the Zamindars. And the common people were alienated in their villages. In other words, repeat the same answer, except stress a little bit more the English conquest. That's the answer to that question. Now, the next question, and we should continue, what were the consequences of the English conquest? Well, I mentioned the consequences of the English conquest. First of all, the English plundered and exported a lot of gold back to England, which financed the industrial and their opposition to the French Revolution. The English destroyed the Indian cotton industry by fixing the tariffs and flooding the country with English cotton goods. They were able to take over the Asian trade. They destroyed the sort of isolation of the villages, the autarky of the villages, and established private property and a landlord class. They unified the country through the Indian National Railway, and through education, they created a modern middle class in India. But there was no economic development in India. India basically became the jewel in the crown of the English Empire. So that's the answer to that question. So now we're moving backwards. There are 2 other questions on India that I haven't covered. And the one, the next question to look at is, why did social dissent almost always assume a religious form in Indian history? Well, I think in terms of answering that, I would say that the main thing to stress in that answer is the entrenchment of Hinduism in the Dark Ages. Remember that period, 600 to 1200, where I said that basically the whole system of Brahmin and military elites, these local elites, established themselves. They, particularly the Brahmins, they basically consolidated the caste system in which they were on top, and they had a religious monopoly because they were the only ones who understood the Veda and the other religious texts in the temples. And they pushed the caste system. Brahmins on top, military soldiers second, Rajputs and so on, then farmers, and then the untouchables. The caste system, the hereditary system of caste, was established in this period of the Dark Ages. And of course, religion was, as a factor in England, in Indian civilization, was already deeply entrenched. And maybe you should mention the fact that the Brahmins go back to the Aryan period. Sanskrit goes back to the Aryan period. During the so-called Iron Age, between 1000 and 600, you have the Varnas, which eventually become the caste, are first being mentioned. There's Buddhism and Taoism during the Age of Empire. So religion is very important. But with the Dark Age, at a local level, this religious caste system, Hinduism with its polytheism and so on, this becomes deeply entrenched, and it means that no real class, sort of political and economic classes, cannot develop in Indian society as a result of this. So religion really plays a inescapable role. And then this is overlaid by the conflict between the Muslims and the Hindus, with the Muslim conquest around 1200 to 1756. They are the ruling class. Everything is justified in terms of religion, and so whatever political life there is expresses itself not in terms of class conflicts, but essentially religious conflicts. And you see this with the development of Bhakti from the 16th century onwards. It's grassroots, religious, mystical, monotheistic, alternative form of religiosity, and it expresses itself eventually in the Sikhs or the Satnami religious sects and so on. But it doesn't, they're not class movements. They're essentially sects which are challenging the dominant religion and the dominant state structure. So that would be the answer to that. And then, let me find the questions. The last question is, that we're looking at is, the survival of ancient Hindu culture was above all due to the localized nature of social organization. Again, the period of the Dark Ages. It's really a sort of a restatement of the previous answer. So I would say that that basically takes care of the review questions, and you have them. They're being recorded, of course. So that more or less deals with that. And so now I can turn to China. We're moving away from India now, and we're coming to China, which is, of course, in terms of the world that we live in today, consideration. China is absolutely fundamental to any kind of world history. You need to know about China. China, let me be blunt, China is the future. And everybody understands it. Even the Americans understand it, but they won't accept it. Canada won't accept it. No, the white Anglo-Saxons have to rule forever. That's their view. These elites who control this society, they're determined to prevent the emergence of China. Well, China has almost 4 times the population of the United States. China has a huge, the people are well educated, politically conscious, very aware of their history. I have lectured in China. I know something about China. And believe me, these people really, their understanding, their sophistication is very considerable. They know as much or more about the world than you and I. So this has to be taken into account. And this is a huge accomplishment because where China was at 70 years ago, 150 years ago was truly terrible. And for them to achieve this is an extraordinary event. And so I want to develop my introduction to China by comparing China and India, because these are the two great states of Asia. And of course, India has become a huge economic power, and its economic power is increasing. But of course, so is China, and I would say that certainly China, in terms of the rate of growth, but also the meaning of growth in China, is very different from India. So let's begin by looking at the question of poverty, which in terms of the study of China and study of India was always in terms of people's awareness, China and India, that's where all these incredible millions and millions of impoverished people live. So what is the situation in India today? Well, 1/3 of the Indian population actually is, I could say, is middle class, or even the old upper class. You'd be surprised, these princes, these mansabdars, they're still around, these people. And they live on huge estates, in the traditional way of life. In India, princes. But 1/3 of the Indian population is basically middle class, and of course they have a big diaspora. Many Indians have immigrated from the middle class, have immigrated to other places. But 2/3 of the Indian population remains mired in the deepest imaginable poverty, and in fact, the upper classes live off the cheap labor of the Indian population. In the case of China, we have two things to bear in mind. On the one hand, it's important to note that China is a highly unequal society. There is serious private money in China. There are millionaires and billionaires in large numbers in China. The middle class is quite strong in China, but the Communist Party and the organized working class and the state bureaucracy is stronger than this middle class, this capitalist class. Let me tell you a story. I lectured when I went to China because I wrote a history of capitalism, which was published by Routledge. You can get it, you can read it, it's a good book. And the Chinese, they translated it, and it has been published in China. A very sort of handsome volume. Well, when I went to Nanjing to lecture at one of the universities there, and they made a big deal of it, and 250 students attended this lecture. So I gave a lecture about my book and so on, and then at the end of it, they said, well, we want you to debate capitalism or socialism with one of our faculty. So they presented this woman who was a graduate of the University of Hong Kong in cultural studies, and before the students, we engaged these large numbers of students in a big debate about capitalism or socialism. Now, what's interesting about this, it does reflect the fact that many of the middle class in China did believe in capitalism. The economics department in many of the universities were teaching capitalist economics. This has all been closed down by Xi Jinping, and these people have been they have been they've had to sort of lie low, is the way I would put it. But they're still there, and some of them still believe in capitalism. I would say that the conflict with the United States and the West and Canada has, in a way, capitalism has been discredited in China because they see what the West is all about in terms of the belligerence of the West. And we could talk about the kidnapping of the vice president of Huawei by the Canadian state, the prostitution of the judicial system in Canada, holding this person for almost 2 years, completely illegally, but they did this, the Canadian government. And so the Chinese understand that Canada, the United States, are basically enemies. They don't want China to rise. And so the drift of things in China has been toward what they call socialism with Chinese characteristics. And this means basically that a system in which the socialist part of the economy dominates, but there continues to be, particularly in the consumer sector, a large private sector and a middle class. So that's now, in terms of the accomplishments, the major accomplishment compared to India is India, 2/3 poverty, China, no poverty. And we do not see what we see in Winnipeg, in downtown Winnipeg, in downtown Nanjing, or the other cities. You do not have what you have here in Canada. On the question of pollution, India, they pay no attention whatsoever. The pollution is just rife, it's just out of control. And in China, there is terrible pollution. In cities like Beijing, there are days when it's really bad. But I would say that China is in the forefront in terms of taking the whole question of the environment seriously. Certainly way more so than does the American or Canadian or any of the Western governments. I would say in terms of government, India is basically controlled by these right-wing nationalists from the middle class, basically, and intolerant and authoritarian. That is the setup in India. In China, of course, it's the Communist Party that rules, 90 million people. And I would say that certainly the Chinese political system is imperfect, to say the least, and in some ways authoritarian. But if you carefully look and say, well, India, there's no comparison in terms of sort of the relationship between the political leaders in China and the grassroots of that society compared to India. But even our society, in terms of actually the way the system works, and I'm talking about the way the universities work in China, who really controls universities, who really controls the workplaces, who controls the political parties, money controls the political parties. The Chinese system is not that bad compared to these others. So that would be my conclusion about that. And I would say that both of these societies are still experiencing huge economic growth, India and China, although the Indian growth, I would say, is uncontrolled, and the pollution problem, the inequality, it's a pretty well hopeless situation. Whereas in China, I would say there is some hope. I'm not saying that the Chinese will succeed, but in terms of the situation of humanity today, if there is a hope, it lies with the Chinese. Now, Where did the hostility from the West start? Well, it started from the time of the revolution, 1949. The West basically put China into quarantine, and the Chinese developed by themselves, essentially, with some help from the Soviet Union. However, there was a reconciliation under Nixon, starting in 1971, and a huge amount of Western, particularly American investment, flowed into China, cheap labor and so on. But then, under the Obama administration, they suddenly woke up, the Americans and their friends, that China was basically taking over. China was out competing the West. And so, from the time of the Obama administration until now, there has been a developing hostility towards China, an attempt to contain China, an attempt to force China to subordinate itself to the United States and to the West. That is the program of the West. And Canada is a full participant in this. You see what Trudeau says every day about the Chinese. We'll get into the background